If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the channel. And if you're enjoying these stories, there's a link below to buy me a cup of coffee. This is the Chassidic Story Project with Barak Hullman, podcasting from Jerusalem, Israel. This podcast is sponsored by listeners just like you. To become a supporter of this podcast, please go to HasidicStory.com, HASIDIC story.com. You'll never know, you'll never know, you'll never know, you'll never know. Shalom Aleichem, my sweetest friends. It's never boring here in the land of Israel, in the Middle East. So this week I have two stories for you. One story for Yud Bes Yud Gimel Tammuz, which is called the Festival of Liberation of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe Bayat, who was released from imprisonment, and also his birthday. But before I begin, I want to dedicate this podcast episode to the continued success, Be'ezrat Hashem, of our soldiers in battle wherever they are, defeating our enemies in a way that we can live in peace, Bashalom, the returning of all the captives, all of the hostages, safe, healthy, whole, and complete, the refuah shlema, the full recovery of everybody who's been injured or who is sick, the comforting of those that lost loved ones, and the continued unity of the Jewish people here in the land of Israel and all around the world, God willing. The first story took place in 1927, only 5 years after the Soviet Union was founded. And part of the Soviet philosophy was to try to wipe out the Jewish religion, because in order to make communism a reality, there couldn't be separations of religion. And of course, there was plenty of anti-Semitism there as well. Now, there were Jews at the time who believed that communism was the solution for the Jewish problem all through history. Because what had happened to the Jews? Every time we had settled in some country, at some point, we were kicked out. Whether it was Spain, the United Kingdom, Poland, Germany, we all know what happened to Jews in Europe and what's happening now. And so before the State of Israel existed, people were trying to find solutions. And one solution was, if everybody was truly equal, like communism wanted everyone to be, at least in theory, then that might be the solution for the Jewish dilemma of not being accepted and not having a place to permanently live. So there were Jews that wanted to get rid of Judaism in order to encourage Jews to simply be Soviet citizens, Soviet comrades. And those Jews were the Jewish division of what eventually became the KGB. Then it was called NKVD, NKVD. So there were Jews that were trying to put out Judaism all throughout the Soviet Union. And the way they did this was by planting undercover agents everywhere to be informers. So nobody knew who was an informer. Sometimes they knew who informers were, but sometimes they didn't. And anyone could be an informer. Even the most religious-looking Jew that you think you might be able to trust, he might be an informer. Your neighbor might be an informer. The rabbi of a shul might be an informer. Nobody knew who the informers were. And so everybody lived in a state of terror. They were scared all the time that someone was going to turn them in to the Soviet police. They might be sent to prison, the gulag, or just be thrown out a window out of a tall building. So in a city in Georgia, which was then a Soviet republic, there was a young man who was one of the students of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rebbe Bayat, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. And this young man was one of the students in the Tomchei Tmimim Chabad Yeshiva, which had recently been established. And he also worked as a chazan, as a cantor, in a Sephardic synagogue, and there they called him a chacham, which was the name that the Sephardim used for rabbi, or scholar. Of course, the government wasn't going to allow a yeshiva to be open, and so they shut it down. And so this young man, being a chassid of the Frierdiker Rebbe, he continued to teach Jewish children in secret, knowing that he was putting his life in danger, and he was risking his family as well. But he knew a Jew without Torah and a Jew without Judaism wasn't a Jew. And so even though the Soviet authorities were trying to prevent Jews from being Jewish, he was going to make sure that he did his part in helping to keep them Jewish. And so, of course, as I said before, there were informers everywhere. And it didn't take long until one of them reported him to the police. And he received a letter to appear at the offices of the NKVD. And he knew he had no place to run. So he showed up at the time that it said in the letter, time and day. And when the guard sees him and he shows up, he says, "Where are your papers?" He shows him his ID, he shows him the letter, and the guard points him to the interrogation room. A couple of minutes later, there are interrogators that come in. and they start asking him questions. Who pays you for teaching Jewish children? Now he had prepared for this, and he said, what are you talking about? What children? Paying for children to teach? Why would anyone want their children to learn about Judaism? That's an old way of thinking. We're modern Soviets. We don't think like that. And so the interrogator said, well, if that's true, then how come you're going to Jewish homes where there are young children there, if it's not to teach them? And he had prepared an answer for this, so he said, well, people call me to remove an ayin hara, an evil eye, because they're superstitious, and they believe that maybe somebody had cursed them, and I'm able to remove the evil eye. And the interrogator started laughing. And they said, seriously, no one believes in superstitions like that. But this Jew was sitting there very serious, so one of the interrogators said, well, at least are you successful in removing the evil eye? And the Chassid said, well, the truth is you don't really know, because every case is unique, but they pay me, and they ask me to come back again. And what do I care, brother, comrade, if they think it works or not? As long as they pay me, I'm happy, and they're happy. But teaching children? Why would I ever do that? And he continued playing dumb as they asked him all kinds of questions. The interrogators wouldn't give up. They continued trying and trying to get an answer out of him, a confession. But the Chassid had an answer for every question they asked. And at some point they said to him, go out, we have to discuss your case. And so, continuing to play dumb, he walked out of the interrogation room and headed straight for the exit of the building. And when the armed guard saw him, he said, where are you going? And he simply said, the interrogators told me to go, which in a sense was true, but they told him to go outside of the room. They didn't tell him to go back home. But he took it as a sign, I'm getting out of here. And the guard, figuring nobody would have the chutzpah, the nerve, to actually say that they were allowed to go without being allowed to go, so he let this chassid walk out the building. And now the chassid knew that he was a wanted man, because as soon as the interrogators realized what had happened, they would send a search party for him. And so he went to his friend's house for a couple of days and slept on the couch, and then he traveled to Rostov. Now Rostov is where the Frierdiker Rebbe was, and he was coming to get a blessing and some advice from the Rebbe. And when he arrives, he sees his fellow Chassidim. They're totally despaired. They're depressed. They're confused. And he says to them, what's going on with you guys? Where's the Rebbe? I need a bracha from the Rebbe. They said the Rebbe has been arrested and sentenced to 3 years of exile in Kostroma. This chassid, he didn't ask any questions. He went straight to the train station and waited for a train to Kostroma, which was something like 1,200 kilometers away, which would be very many hours on a train. And when he arrived in Kostroma, he asked where the Lubavitcher Rebbe was, the Rebbe Rayatz. And when he arrived, the Chassidim that were there, they didn't want to let this guy in. They knew that the Rebbe was there because he was being punished. Of course, we know he was being punished for refusing to give up to teach Jewish children to be Jews. And all of his activities in the Soviet Union, such as smuggling in talitot, tzitziot, tefillin, prayer books. There were secret mikvahs in people's closets. They would do secret britot, circumcisions. And for all of these things, the Frierdiker Rebbe was arrested and sent into exile in Kostroma. So they knew, if this chassid is coming to see the Rebbe, well, the Soviet authorities would see that, and they would realize that they hadn't achieved their goal. And it might lead, God forbid, chas v'shalom, to them deciding to do something worse to the Rebbe. But this chassid wouldn't give up. First of all, his life was on the line, maybe his whole family, and he had traveled quite a lot to get there. He was going to get his bracha from the Rebbe, whatever it took. And so eventually he was granted a yechidus, a private audience with the Rebbe, and explains to the Rebbe what happened. And the Rebbe told him specifically what to do. He said, I want you to travel to Moscow, and you're going to go to these Chassidim. And he wrote down their names. He said, they have legitimate permits allowing them to do business, where they purchase and resell merchandise. I want you to go and try to get one of the documents that says that you're allowed to buy and resell merchandise with your name and your ID. And then once you have that document, you're going to return back to the NKVD office and present yourself to them. And when they say to you, why did you run away? Where did you go? You're going to answer them that since they thought that your profession of removing ayin hara, the evil eye, was not a real profession, you decided to take them seriously and to change your method of income. So you decided to go into business. And that's why you left all of a sudden, so that you could go into business and buy some merchandise and follow their wonderful advice. And then the Rebbe gave him a note that had specific instructions for one of the elder Chassidim, Barak Shalom. And he would be able to make the connection with the businessman, but he warned both of them, as soon as Barak Shalom saw the note, they were to immediately destroy it. So after Shabbos, he took a train to Moscow. And there he noticed that the train station was filled with people. And for sure, many of them were secret agents of the NKVD. And so he did everything he could not to raise any suspicion. He got on the first trolley in the direction of Moscow. And looking for somebody safe to sit next to, he saw an elderly, very religious-looking, bearded Jew. And it's true that anyone could have been an informant, but this chassid had a feeling that this old man was someone he could trust. And so the chassid sat down next to the older Jew, and the two of them are looking at one another through the side of their eyes, trying to figure out if one of the other is a secret agent. And eventually, the older Jew says, "From where does this Jew come?" And the chassid said, "Kostroma." And the elder man's face lit up. So the chassid assumed that this elderly Jew wasn't an informant. And he said to him, "Maybe you know a Rebbe Baruch Shalom?" And the elder Jew, he says, "Baruch Shalom, that's me." And so they silently sat there together until Rebbe Baruch Shalom got off the trolley and walked back home. And as soon as they closed the door, the two of them hugged and kissed cheeks, as was the custom amongst Russian Chassidim. And Rebbe Baruch Shalom wants to know, how was the Rebbe? And why did you see the Rebbe? And what are you doing here? And the Chassid shows Rebbe Baruch Shalom the letter from the Rebbe. And for him just to hold the letter that the Rebbe had written or even touched was so meaningful. He read the letter, which said to help this chassid obtain documents to allow him to buy and sell merchandise. And then, Baruch Shalom, he kissed the paper and threw it into the fire, like the Rebbe had told them. The chassid was amazed, because he had just gotten off the train from the Rebbe and arrived in Moscow. And the first trolley he gets in, he sits down next to the exact person that he's looking for. In the whole city of Moscow, how could it be that he just sat down next to the right person? And when Rebbe Baruch Shalom heard this, he said, "Normally, I don't go anywhere before I daven Shachrit. But this morning, I woke up early, and I had this urge to get on a trolley for some reason." And he said, "Look at the wonderful ways of Hashgacha Pratit, of divine supervision. When a person is traveling with the Rebbe's power, the truth is, miracles are not really miracles." And so the next day, the Chassidim got together, mainly the elder Chassidim in Moscow, and they had a farbrengen with this younger Chassid who had just been by the Rebbe. And the Chassid conveyed regards from the Rebbe to all the Chassidim. Of course, they were very happy. They were all making an effort to secure the release of the Rebbe, which they hoped would be in the coming days. And then they were hoping that after that, the Rebbe would be given permission to leave the Soviet Union. So this Chassid and Rebbe Baruch Shalom, they did exactly as the Rebbe said. They met the right people. They got the right papers, and now it was time for the chassid to return back home and face the NKVD, the secret police. It's one thing to visit the Rebbe and get a bracha, and for miracles to happen. It's another thing to walk into the secret police's office when you know that you're a wanted man. And so when he arrived, even though he knew that everyone was looking for him, he first went to his family and told them everything that had happened. And he said that he planned on going straight into the offices of the NKVD and volunteer himself to be interrogated. But his family said, "You've already escaped. Why would anybody with a sane mind come back here? And not only come back here, but go and present yourself to the secret police? Do you really think this is going to work?" And he said, "Of course. The Rebbe told me what to do. There's no question in my mind. No doubt whatsoever that the Rebbe's advice will work for me, whatever is meant to be." And even though his family was trying to plead with him to stay, he simply walked out of the house and went straight to the offices of the secret police. When he arrived, the same guard was there, and he recognized this Jew who had escaped when he was guarding the offices. He immediately puts handcuffs on him and takes him into the interrogator's office. And when the interrogators show up, he says, "Oh, you guys were upset at me, but look what I found. He just showed up here." So right away, the interrogators wanted to know, "Where were you? Why did you run away? Who do you think you are?" And the chassid said very calmly, "I didn't run away." They said, "Well, you were here before and then you were gone." He said, "Yes, because you laughed at my profession. You said removing the evil eye isn't a real profession. So I went to Moscow and I got papers to buy and sell merchandise. And now I'm a businessman, just like you told me." And then he presented them with the paperwork to prove what he was saying was true. The interrogators went over the papers, and they were real papers. They checked them with their colleagues in Moscow. And they said to this chassid, "Well, you made a fine choice, not wanting to teach Judaism and to become a businessman. But let me give you some advice. Even better than being a businessman is to be a simple worker here in the Soviet Union. That is the greatest success in life. And that is the highest aspiration a person could long for. And this chassid just nodded his head and he said, well, I will consider that. If business doesn't work out for me, maybe I'll take a job in a factory. And one of the interrogators said, you're lucky that you turned yourself in. Because were we to find you and catch you, we would have sentenced you to 10 years of hard labor in Siberia. All right, you go back home. And instead of business, this bourgeois capitalist way, you should become a simple worker, like us good Soviet citizens. And so the chassid, through his faith in the Rebbe, through following the Rebbe's instructions, was a free man. And every year on Yud Bes and Yud Gimel Tammuz, the 12th and 13th of the Jewish month of Tammuz, this Jew would always have a farbrengen and celebrate his freedom. And of course, they were the same dates as the Rebbe's release from exile. And he would always say, it's all thanks to the vision of the great tzaddik, the Rebbe Rayatz, the simple emunah, the simple faith of one of his little chassidim, little me, that by having faith in the Rebbe was able to stand on the shoulders of a giant and be saved from a terrible fate. I have another story for you. This took place in 1982 here in Israel. People were suggesting that Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu run for the position of chief rabbi of Israel. But there was one problem. His Rebbitzin, Rabbanit Tzivia, she didn't agree. She felt that it was too much for him. They already had crowds that gathered at the doorstep of his house every morning to ask him questions. The phone was ringing day and night except for on Shabbos. To make matters more complicated, she knew that her husband, Rabbi Eliyahu, was such a true and sweet man. He wouldn't turn away anyone, no matter what he was doing or what time of day it was. It didn't matter how small or trivial a question was. Rabbi Eliyahu would drop whatever he was doing and do his best to answer the question. So the Rabbanit figured to herself, if we're already inundated with so many phone calls and visits before my husband becomes the chief rabbi, imagine what would happen were he to take that position. And on top of that, she feared that he would never have a free moment for his family. And when Rabbi Eliyahu heard that his wife objected to him being appointed as chief rabbi, he immediately told everyone that he's not taking the job. Even if he's elected, he's not taking it. If the Rebbitzin doesn't agree, I'm not doing it. But then the Rebbitzin Tzivia, she started thinking, my husband helps so many Jews, and it's an important job, the chief rabbi of Israel. And so many people want him to have this role. Maybe she was making a mistake, trying to stand in his way. And so she changed her mind, and Rabbi Eliyahu agreed to be a candidate. But then shortly before the vote, the Rebbitzin again asked her husband to pull out of the race. But the pressure was building up. More and more people wanted the rabbi to have the job. People recalled the time that Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu spent in prison. This was in the 1950s, when he was part of a radical group that was opposing non-kosher restaurants and violations of Shabbos. In 1951, and other people will come up with stories of the great self-sacrifice that Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu had. And so the Rabbanit didn't know what to do. She was worried that a position like that would put him under so much pressure, would take all of his time and energy. And on Erev Shabbat, the Rabbanit Tzivia, she poured out her heart to her husband, telling him all of her hesitations. And on Motzei Shabbos, she started receiving phone calls. First was from the Baba Sali, who told her that she shouldn't fight the candidacy of Rabbi Eliyahu because it was decreed in heaven that he should be the chief rabbi. And shortly after, she gets a phone call from the Gerer Rebbe, and he says the same thing. And a few minutes later, there's a messenger from the Lubavitcher Rebbe with the same message. It says, in heaven, they chose you. Now, the Rebbitzin believed that these messages were from truly holy people, and they were actually sent from heaven. And it was as if the tzaddikim understood that she was having doubts and that it might change the decree from heaven, and she might convince her husband not to actually run for a position that he was meant to have. So the next day, she decided to go to visit Rabbi Yitzchak Kadori, who was known as the greatest Mikubal alive at the time. And when she got to Rabbi Kadori, she said to him, should my husband run for the chief rabbi or not? And he looks at the Rebbitzin and he said, why are you asking me when you can ask your own husband? And she said, Rabbi Kaduri, my husband is a great scholar. He's a rabbi who gives rulings in Jewish law, but he's not a mekuban like you, Rabbi. And Rabbi Kaduri laughed, and he said, everything I know, I learned from your husband's father. All the Kabbalah I know, his father taught me. So how could it be that his father taught me and he didn't teach his own son? I guarantee you, your husband has the power to bless, and all of his blessings will be fulfilled. Of course he can bless. And then Rabbi Kaduri asked, did you get a phone call or a message from the Baba Sali, the Gera Rebbe, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe? And when the Rebbitzin nodded her head and said yes, Rabbi Kaduri raised his hand and he said, what more do you need? I have confirmed to you that it's decreed in heaven, and so did these other great tzaddikim. There's no question, Rebbitzin, this is what he's meant to do. So the Rabbanit thought to herself, how could Rav Kaduri know that these rabbis had called her Motzei Shabbos? She didn't imagine that they had all called him in advance, so she understood that it really was decreed from heaven, and she agreed to support her husband as being the chief rabbi of Israel. And as everybody knows, he was a very popular and beloved chief rabbi who passed away in 2010 at the age of 81. And the Rebbitzin says, after her husband's passing away, when I think back to all that happened during that time, I wonder why I was doubting whether my husband could handle the job or not. How could I have not seen the greatness of my husband back in those days? And then she realized he was such a great tzaddik. He was able to hide himself even from his own wife. And maybe even today, after so many stories have been shared about Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, maybe he's still concealing himself even now. Thank you so much for listening. As always, my sweetest friends, I want to thank one of the contributors to the podcast, the Mapur family, and also Holy Brother Aaron from Brooklyn. Thank you very much for your contribution. And to all the people that sent in contributions and sent me emails and messages, thank you very much. Please keep on sharing and listening. And Be'ezrat Hashem, next week, I'll have some more stories. Until then, my sweetest friends, have a beautiful Shabbos, a beautiful Yud Bes and Yud Gimel Tammuz, and take care of yourselves. Sei gesund.